So welcome back. So now we are going to start a new topic. So in the last two sessions we discussed about the fiscal policy. In this particular session we will be talking about the new topic that is part of the course, Indian economy some contemporary perspective, and it talks about the India and WTO. So India and WTO the topic is important in the contemporary context, because now it looks like that we have to go for a now we are seeing a lot of change in the economy, and even at the trade front. Now countries are interacting at different levels of the free trade agreements and the regional agreements, and that is also giving a lot of idea about how we can go for harmonizing the trade relations. Now one aspect that we have at the country level is that each and every sovereign country is having some affairs which are internal to the economy and some affairs which are external to the economy. So trade is one area where the country will have the control on the supply, but once but whether the suppliers or the in terms export and import, so you are ready to export, but whether the importers are happy about your export or not, that matters a lot. So for that reason there has been a controversy in the past also, that how these trade relations can be harmonized with the interest, a common interest of both exporter and importers. And there have been some instances of disputes. Countries are not happy, especially when we have the income inequalities with respect to income, with respect to income, and then we have the developed countries and developing countries. Developed countries have the interest in expanding the business services and other activities. The developing countries have interest in agriculture and associated activities, and where they take the lead. But in primary and agriculture activities also, the developed countries have the advantage, because they provide excess subsidies to their farmers. The kind of technological expertise they have, the developing countries lack. As a result, some kind of sophistication to their produce, it is not possible. But even if there is a equivalent amount of or equal quality of produce produced by the developing countries, there is not equal playing or level playing field for the developing economies. And that's why it was realized in 1940s that going ahead it is going to be the big issue, because then some countries which were underdeveloped at that point of time, which have felt that these countries have the potential and they may also grow after some time. So it's better that they should be given some emphasis or some kind of priorities with regard to the trade. So in the 40s this idea came up. So we'll be discussing from the historical perspective of WTO, some background, not much, and then we'll be focusing more on the policy side. So let's start. So it is about the India and WTO. In lecture 36 we are discussing about. So this is about the World Trade Organization. So the Ministry of Commerce and Trade, Government of India, OECD Inside Trade. One of the best sources I would recommend to the students, those who are in economics and those who are going to develop interest in the trade area, I would recommend that the best source is the World Trade Organization, though it may look very exhaustive with regard to the readings, but I would always recommend that you should go to the original website, original source, and read about the norms, because they update the content very frequently, and it is always good to know about the recent developments. So each and every country have the Ministry of Commerce and Trade. The Ministry of Commerce and Trade also gives idea about the rules and regulations of WTO. So this also web page is also very important. So I would recommend the participants to at least visit this. I found OECD Insights International Trade, one document that has given a lot of insights about the developing countries' interest, that how developing countries are going to bargain and what are the concerns of the developing countries and how they are going to talk about. Similarly, I also found one interesting chapter in the Economic Survey 2015-16 is about chapter 8, Then I found a good write-up by Prabir Day on the WTO trade facilitation agreement concerns and issues. So if somebody is interested in having a deeper insights, this research paper will help. Similarly, the Ravi Kant paper, WTO upside down, this is also a very good reading, and I would also appreciate if some of you may would like to go about it. Impact on India of tariff and quantitative restriction under WTO. This also is a working paper. It is freely available. So all these links that I mentioned is important. You will find a lot of materials available on the net, but I won't recommend each and every material because the source should be authentic and it should be credible. So the best source, I would still recommend that you should go to WTO website. You should read the World Trade Report. It also mentions about the digitalization, how digital space, which is now every country is emphasizing on, the automation, the production process, supply chain, how this is going to be distorted or going to be augmented with the application of digital technology, how it will have the interference with the labor market. Those things are being discussed, and in the light of the changes that we have seen, whatever we have the rules defined under WTO, how these rules will be again realigned with those digital interventions that we are going to see in every aspect of the human being. So it is a very nice report. I would recommend some of you to read at least the executive summary of that report, not in detail if you don't have time, because that also gives a lot of idea. So those who are going to work in the area of trade, I would request that they should go through these references, and if they find it some more, I have also referred one or two more sources wherever possible. I have cited and I have mentioned it about, and then let's start with the idea of WTO. So the key learning objectives going ahead for 20 minutes would be that we'll be focusing on the evolution of World Trade Organizations, how World Trade Organization has evolved, the market integration process, how countries, when they feel threatened about the from the dominance of some other country, how they become part of the preferential trade agreements or some kind of customs unions or some kind of trade some kind of free trade agreements that we have. To give an overview of these developments with India's economic system, wherever possible I have given the reference of India's economics and India's economic policies, and how the from the trade aspect which all sectors are more vulnerable and how some components of that being impacted. So the general agreements on tariffs and trade after the Bretton Woods agreement, it was set up. So apart from the World Bank and the IMF, we had set up this general agreement on tariffs and trade, just to take into account. So for development it was World Bank, for trade and financing it was IMF, International Monetary Fund, and then for specifically for trade and trade relations, trade contracts, trade agreements, just to harmonize the global trade at as one of the leading indicators, this general agreement on tariffs and trade was formed. In the Uruguay round, that still becomes the reference year for most of the trade or the tariff bounds that we say in the sphere of WTO. 1986 to 1994, GATT was replaced by the WTO on 1st January 1995, and WTO is the same multilateral institution like we have the World Bank and IMF. It is also a forum where government, if they feel that they are being misled or they are being victimized, or they feel that they are being not given a fair deal of trade, then they can always come and try to settle the disputes whatever they have. It works on the single undertaking cloud, wherein there will be one ministerial meeting, and under that they decide about. So any country party to an agreement under WTO is automatically party to any other agreement, even if it is not part of that. So this is one benefit, but it is not always the case. You have to be part of those committees, those parties where you are participating. But WTO, though it started with the GATT, but then after some time it became the WTO during 1990s. So there the WTO have become the notorious I would say organizations in terms of notorious will be the harsh term, but it has become the controversial controversial organization because of the controversies that we always observe whenever there will be a ministerial meeting, especially with regard to agriculture, industrial tariffs, non-tariff barriers. Then we have the services and trade remedies. So these are the areas where it becomes really tough for the participants or the participating countries, and even for the WTO to arrive at one conclusive recommendation that what will be the particular policy framework and how this is going to be decided. The most significant differences are between developed nations led by the EU, US and Japan and other. Now we have the BRICS countries. So BRICS countries have taken the lead and they have started giving they have started arguing on different issues, and these are the countries which have become the forefront of the WTO dealings, and in each and every meeting one or the other country takes the lead on one of the issues concerned for BRICS. So here it is. So among the WTO, one more the contentious issue is the agriculture subsidies, which has been given by the so there is some kind of disagreement on that between developed and developing countries. Among the WTO meetings, Uruguay round holds important because this has specified certain norms and that are still applicable for the member countries. One is that it is about the market access. So it talks about the tariffs, non-tariff barriers, textile, garments, agriculture, tropical products, natural resource based products. So it talks about the tariffication, that how should be the tariff rate and how it will be. So for developed countries there are specific targets, for developing countries there are specific targets, and they are being also given some bounds. Then we have the rules, subsidies and countervailing measures, safeguards, anti-dumping, dispute resolution, GATT articles, MTN agreements and other arrangements that we have. So which means that these rules are important just for the sake of the going for the fair trade practice. There should not be any kind of dominance by one or the another member. Some new areas are being explored. For example, the trade related intellectual property rights, we have the TRIPS, and trade related investment measures services, that is called TRIMS. So these two are the new areas because of the widespread because of the diversification of trade activities. Now these two are added again later, and it was found that these two are playing very important role with regard to the violation of the copyright and other. So these are the areas, these are the functionalities where WTO functions. Then it works on the 5 principles that WTO is having. One is called trade without discrimination, which means that whatever number of countries are participating in one group or the members of WTO, they have to emphasize that they practice the trade or they simply encourage the trade, foreign trade, without discriminating any member country if they are part of. Trade without discrimination is having one more aspect to deal with, which is about the most favored nation, which means that MFN just to make sure that the WTO members are aligned to the non-discriminatory clause that has been mentioned, they have been given something called most favored nation. So each and every country is trying to has this status of MFN, but given the geopolitical dynamics, they can also decide about whether the country should be given MFN status or not. So for instance, between India and Pakistan, India has given MFN status, but sometime the Pakistan, because of the geopolitical issues, does not reciprocate in the same manner. So that has also become one area. A trade concession granted to one WTO member automatically applied to all others. So most favored nation also helps in that. So if you are going to give one concession to one country, then it becomes automatically, but then the surroundings and the domestic conditions, or sorry, the border conditions also applies, and that's why in practice this has not been possible. So, national treatment guarantees equal treatment of imported goods with domestically produced output in national market. So, those are the areas wherein if you have the similar set of goods and if you are part of that, then there is a some kind of provision under WTO that under MFN that this goods should be applied or should be allowed, but in reality it does not happen. The second principle is the freer trade through the progressive liberalization of trade regimes. So, if you have gone for quantitative restrictions, or if you have imposed certain tariffs and both countries are part of WTO, then there is some kind of rationalization of that. There are some kind of rationalization provisions made, so that developed countries are given more opportunities to go for higher reduction in tariffs. The developing countries are given a somewhat lesser opportunity for going for the reduction in the tariffs and those kind of quantitative and non-quantitative measures, even non-tariff barriers. So, it is about the free trade, but free trade will only be possible when you have the less frictions. So, just to minimize those frictions or those restrictions, disputes, second principle deals with that. The third principle is about the predictability of trade rules. Predictability in this case prevents government from arbitrarily raising existing tariffs on non-tariff trade barriers, which means that if you have two countries sharing the border, and if there is some kind of dispute and then the country takes immediate measure, then in that case the WTO is also rule is also enforceable. And in most of the countries, when the things are normal, then this becomes the norm, but for some cases it may not be. For example, for the regional agreements, it may happen that one member which wants to be part of this regional agreement, but because of some common concern it is asking for some agreement, but in reality this is also quite difficult difficult in practice. The fourth principle is the fair competition. Fair competition attempts to level the level playing field in international trade and minimize the market distortions caused by export subsidy, dumping and others. So, dumping in one exercise wherein if you have the excess of any commodity or any produce, and if you think that by selling at cheaper price outside you will be at least able to exhaust this amount, and which seems that the cost of storing or any keeping that product is much higher than simply selling at the low price, then in that case it becomes the case of dumping, that even if you are selling at 5 rupees in India, but you are since it is in large quantity and it is continuously in produce, so it is very difficult to keep that amount. You are ready to sell that at 2 rupees in Nepal or neighboring countries, then that becomes the case of dumping. And then here you have the export subsidy. So, in case of agriculture, it typically happens that most of the first world countries have given export subsidies to their farming community, and as a result this has also become, so once you produce some amount of output and you have been given the export subsidy, then your goods become cheaper, and in international market it becomes competitive, attractive for the buyer. So, the export surges, but in reality it is not the cost of production, but it has been brought down artificially. So, for those artificial interventions, WTO fourth principle deals with. Fifth principle is the economic development through trade. So, if you have gone through any trade book, you have the gains from trade, the one topic. So, it talks about that how economic development, especially the spillover, the growth spillover that you have from rich to poor to rich, those spillovers may catapult the livelihood or the livelihood opportunities of the developing country. As a result, the convergence may start happening. So, trade may become one source of economic development. So, these are the 5 principles that we always mention. Then the major issues that we always talk about in case of WTO is that Since 2011, the developing country share in the foreign trade has increased, and once we have the developing country share increasing, then this is also giving more bargaining power to these countries to bargain well at the WTO meetings, and this has resulted in controversy, and in some cases we find that in some meetings these developing countries have dominated over the developed countries, and that's why for some regions certain rules have not been devised, and it is still in pending. So if you look at the number, it appears that the BRICS share, which is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, Russia, it has its share has increased from 8% in 2000 to 19% in 2013. The share of least developed countries in world exports increased from 0.5% of total trade in 1995 to 1.1% in 2014. Similarly, emerging economies dynamics, and similarly the diversification that these countries are experiencing the surge in economic activities, the diversity. For instance, India has diversified its economy in services sector. Services sector requires different kind of movement of factor of production, and that has also become the WTO issue, because in countries where there is a factor movement from India to those countries and they are trying to do businesses, then it becomes the case of visa and other agreements. So wherever you have the labor movement happening, so in case of services, this is quite obvious that if service driven economy requires the different set of skills and different set of movement of labor, so if those movements are being restricted, just keeping in mind the dominance of one country, then that becomes a controversial subject. So that's why in this context the WTO guidelines are quite confusing and quite ambiguous. Emerging economies dynamism and level of competitiveness that have achieved require the definition of a new equilibrium in international trade relations. Another challenge is the preferential trade agreement. So now we will be going for some kind of discussion on that, what is it is all about. So then we have the partial scope agreement, and under that there will be agreement among the set of countries on the on the smaller number of commodities. So suppose there will be some incentives given that out of 50 commodities that we are trading among ourselves, we will be only charging tariffs on 30, 20 will be free. So that is called the partial scope agreement, that is called PSA. PSA is only partial in scope, meaning it allows for trade between countries on a smaller number of goods. Then we have the free trade agreements. A free trade agreement is a preferential arrangement in which you have the members reducing tariffs on trade among themselves, but not with their members. It is just the small, or I would say we have the closed group, and this group will be going for a free trade agreement, which means that there will be free movement of goods and the factor of production, but these countries may have the trade relations with another country, so they will be deciding by themselves. So this will not be part of FTA. Then there we have the custom unions. So members not only remove trade barriers among themselves, but also adopt a common set of external barriers. For example, they will be not only just going for the free trade agreement kind of thing, but also adopt a common set of external barriers, in the sense that if some countries are going to have the trade relation with them, then they will be having some kind of uniform rates complied, and then they have to agree with those rates for trade relations. For example, members allow full freedom of factors flow among themselves, in addition to having some kind of custom union that you have, right. So this is what there are some organizations, for example Mercosur, then here you have the Southern African Customs Union. So these unions help understand this. Then you have the common markets. So common markets, so members simply unify all their economic policies, including monetary, fiscal, welfare. So the European Union that you have, in European Union most of the countries they share not only the trade aspect, but also the other policy parameters are also aligned. So in that case they will have the monetary, fiscal, welfare policies aligned, so that becomes the common markets. The economic unions, it is the composed of the common market with a customs union, economic community of central states and all. If it is going to be the common market for all, then it becomes the economic unions. Common market is the most extreme form of the union that you say, apart from the customs union that you have. In terms of WTO meetings, the recent meeting was supposed to be held in Nur Sultan during June, but Nur Sultan is a city in Kazakhstan, and this and because of the pandemic, it has been postponed, and after that there is no confirmation. But the Kazakh government has given an option that they can schedule it in January or in 2021. So far it has not been. I did not see any kind of news about it, but in 2020 it was planned in the Nur Sultan, Kazakhstan. Then you have the Air. So this was the in 2017. Then they had the Nairobi 2015. Then they had the Bali, and then there was a meeting in Geneva. Then there was meeting in 2 times in Geneva. Then Hong Kong. Hong Kong meeting is quite popular. Then there was a controversial meeting in Doha that also talked about. So we'll be dealing with those meetings also. If we talk about the negotiations, then negotiations happen on 2 fronts. One is goods and another is services. On goods front, if you talk about, so in goods front you have the WTO members arguing with regard to the quality and the access to the market, but the negotiations hovers around the lowering the custom unions rate and the trade barriers, whatever the trade barriers they have, both quantitative and non-quantitative, and even the non-tariff barriers they talk about. And in most of the cases, it has been found that the WTO has to devise certain rules and regulations to deal with, especially with regard to agriculture, textiles. Then we have the state trading, then you have the product standards, then you have the subsidies and other things. So it becomes automatically important to understand that how these goods are going to be. So the major concern remains same about this, that the tariff rationalization of tariff and customs that you have, duty rates, the dominance of the lower income countries and the lower middle income and upper middle income countries, and even the to some extent developed countries, the agriculture remains one controversial subject. And then you have the textile, and then the topics hovers around the quality of the product plus subsidies. And one recent has been added, one is called dumping, because it has been found that among the developing countries also some countries have been engaged in dumping their products in some other countries. So that has also been noticed, and because of that dumping becomes one of the. Then becomes the services. Since the financial sector is well diversified sector and it has the connectivity with the rest of the world, and it has the higher connectivity in terms of not just services but also in terms of moving the factor of production, especially the factors that we have, labor and capital. So to keep in mind, there has been rules have been framed in that direction. So you have the general agreement on tariffs, trade and services. So GATS allows the banking, financial services, trade, tourism, travel industry, leisure industry to operate across the WTO member countries freely and without discrimination. So that also applies under the GATS. WTO members have also made individual commitments under GATS, stating which of their services sectors they are willing to open, foreign competition, how to open these markets. But in services, the issue is that once you devise a uniform policy, then it may not be suitable, because then there will be market distorting factors playing a role. And that's why under GATS some concerns are being addressed, that if the country feels that opening of a business services or particular services may harm the market, so they can take certain measures about that. But GATS deals with the services. Under GATT you have the different annexures in terms of agreement on agriculture, different boxes dealing with subsidies and other trade barriers, those we will be talking about. Then here you have the intellectual property rights that become really important issue. So intellectual property rights are one of the areas where we will have to focus some more attention. So going ahead, as services will expand, there will be more cases of identity, there will be more cases of some kind of uniqueness. So keeping that in mind, here you have the copyrights, trademarks, geographical indicators mentioned over there. So the IPR deals in detail about this, how these disputes can be resolved, and some uniqueness whatever you have in terms of geographical indication. For example, the product of some commodities may be on the name of geography where they come from. For example, you have the champagne, then you have the tequila, and all these products. Then you have Coca-Cola, Amul, some cases of IPR issues. So these are the aspects added later to the WTO, and that's why negotiations, whenever there will be negotiation, they will be negotiating on this. So let me summarize whatever we have discussed. So far we have discussed about the WTO basic framework. We are trying to understand the different negotiations happening, issues, principles of WTO. Now we will be moving toward the non-tariff barriers and other cases, especially with regard to agriculture, and that will give you the idea that how WTO should be dealing with these cases. Thank you so much.